Thank you very much. It's a great delight to be here. It's a wonderful place. And the area where we're sleeping is inhabited by lots and lots of martins. It's very nice. They make a lot of noise in the morning. There's a little nest halfway down. Anyway, I suggested this talk on love in Dionysios, Areopagite and St. Maximus the Confessor. Right, although St. Maximus the Confessor acknowledges his debt to the Areopagite on several occasions, and indeed cites him several times in his centuries on love, when we compare the way in which the two fathers, Dionysius and Maximus, treat the concept of love, their approach seems very different. Dionysius' treatment is fundamentally metaphysical. His longest discussion of love occurs in chapter 4 of the Divine Names, the chapter which is dedicated to the first of the Divine Names, that is the name of the good. Maximus discusses love in virtually all his works in one way or another. Nevertheless, there are two treatises dedicated specifically to love, to Agape. Namely, the second letter, which was addressed to John the Chamberlain, and his 4 centuries on love, dedicated to an otherwise unknown Father Elpidios, most likely a fellow monk, for whom Maximus also composed his questions and answers called the Liber Asceticus. These works are, in one sense, complementary. The first was written for a layman, a high-ranking court official, while the Centuries on Love were written for a fellow monk. And what I propose to do in this paper is first to set out an account of Dionysius' doctrine of love derived from the Divine Names, chapter 4 primarily, and then an account of Maximus' doctrine based on the works I've mentioned, though in fact it's almost entirely on the Centuries on love. And then go on to explore what connections I can see, which may, I hope, show some of the ways in which their very different approaches converge. The Divine Names, chapter 4, as I said, is dedicated to the first of the Divine Names, the good, to be followed in later chapters by discussions of being, life, wisdom, and various other names, ending up with the perfect, or the one. To start with the good betrays Dionysius' fundamentally Platonic affinities. He is well aware of the position the form of the good holds in Plato's thought, especially in the Republic. The analogy of the sun at the end of the 6th book of the Republic lies behind Dionysius' initial reflections on the good. Dionysius soon moves on to add to the notion of the good, to agathon, the notion of the beautiful, to kalon, or beauty, kalos. These, he says, are not to be distinguished because beauty is the cause of harmony and splendour in everything. It is, says Dionysius, echoing the important site of Plotinus's, it shines on everything beautiful, bestowing on it a radiance from beyond, a ray pouring out from a hidden source. It is because it calls, kalun, everything to itself, that it is called kalos, beauty. Beauty is not just something pleasing, it lies at the heart of reality. And I quote, "For beauty is the cause of harmony, of sympathy, of community. Beauty unites all things and is the source of all things. It is the great creating cause which bestirs the world and holds all things in existence by longing, eros, inside them to have beauty. The beautiful is therefore the same as the good, for everything looks to the beautiful and the good as the cause of being, and there is nothing in the world without a share of the beautiful and the good." It is because of the good and the beautiful, though I don't actually think Dionysius ever uses the Greek compound word, kalokagathia, it is because of the good and the beautiful that everything exists, and everything relates to each other, one to another. Both the harmony of all things and their mutual sympathy, as well as their individual reality, are owing to the good and the beautiful. Dionysius speaks of koinoniae, communions, as it were, of the opposed, asimixie, sort of the united, pronia, of the higher, and alilukia, of the like constituted, and the epistrophe, of the more needy. All of these manifest the rest and the repose, protecting and unchanging, that beings have among themselves. Dionysius goes on to speak of the threefold movement, direct, circular, and spiral, that are to be found among both intellects and souls. And from these movements, all inspired by the good and the beautiful, comes all the variety and harmony of the cosmos. Such movement originates from the desire and the love, both Eros and Agapi, that all things have for the good and the beautiful. This leads into what appears at first sight to be a digression, but is more than that, about the use of the terms Eros and Agapi. He imagines objectors to his use of Eros, because it is not found in the scriptures. One might wonder why someone writing, most likely in the early 6th century, would see this as a still live issue. It's been discussed for centuries. But of course Dionysius is pretending to be writing at the end of the 1st century, and is aware of objectors to the use of Eros in earlier times. And indeed, in his consciousness of his musk, he almost lets it slip. For it is clear, though only pointed out very recently by Istvan Perzel, that Dionysius bases himself in this section on Origen's discussion of Eros and Agapi in the preface to his commentary on the Song of Songs. He condenses and misses out much of Origen's lengthy argumentation, but his argument that Eros and Agapi have the same meaning, and that what matters is the power of what is meant, the dynamis ton skopo, to skopu, and not simply words. This argument is Origen's, as well as most of the citations that he uses in support of his argument. Proverbs 4:6 and 4:8 in the Septuagint, where the word based on Eros is used. Erastite autis, love her, spoken by wisdom. Wisdom 8:2, I became a lover of her beauty. Erastes eienomi. And also the citation from the divine Ignatius. My love, my Eros, has been crucified, from Ignatius to the Romans 7:2. And just before introducing that quotation from Ignatius, Dionysius remarks that it appears that some of our writers on sacred matters, Eirologon, that the name Eros is more divine than that of Agapi. One would expect, in the context, Dionysius to be referring to scriptural writers, though his usual word for the scriptural writers is not hierologon, writers of sacred words, as it were, but theologon, writers about God. And indeed he goes on to quote Ignatius. But I think there is another writer who does seem to say that Eros is more divine than Agapi, to whom he's in a kind of way referring. And that is St. Gregory of Nyssa. In his first homily on the Song of Songs, he argues for using Eros in preference to Agapi. And in the 13th homily, he says that Agapi, stretched to intensity, epitetameni, is Eros. I'm not suggesting that Dionysius would have expected his readers to pick up that reference. That would have been to completely blown his pseudonym. But if they thought of Gregory of Nyssa in that context, it would have confirmed the impression that Dionysius is wanting to give, that Dionysius is a thoroughly orthodox theologian, that his ideas lie behind the formation of orthodoxy in the 4th and 5th century. His teaching on love, Eros, is summed up a paragraph or two later. Divine Eros, he says, is ecstatic, which I think could be a paraphrase of Gregory's epitetemeni agapi, or Eros legate. Eros is said to be agapi, stretched out, so that lovers belong not to themselves, but to those they love. This is manifest in the providence shown to the weaker by the higher, in the mutual regard for those of equal status, and in the more divine return of the lower towards the first. Therefore also the divine Paul, possessed by divine Eros and swept up by its ecstatic power, says with a divine voice, I live, but no longer I, but Christ lives in me. As a true lover, and beside himself, as he says in God, he is living not his own life, but that life exceedingly longed for, the life of his beloved. And Dionysius goes on to add that we must dare add this, as being no less true, that the source of all things himself, in his wonderful and good love for all things, through the excess of his loving goodness, is carried outside himself in his providential care for all that is. So enchanted is he in goodness and love and longing. Removed from his position above all and beyond all, he descends to be in all according to an ecstatic and transcendent power, which is yet inseparable from himself. And he goes on to say furthermore that the divine love shows especially its unending nature without beginning, like some eternal circle, travelling in unerring revolution through the good, from the good, in the good, and into the good, always with the same centre, and in accordance with itself, eternally proceeding and remaining, and being restored to itself. This seems to me goes well beyond Aristotle's vision of the unmoved mover, moving through being loved. In ecstatic divine love, God moves through the whole of his creation. Note that in this section as well, Dionysius is not, I think, thinking of God's love in the incarnation, but simply of love, of his cosmic love, his love in creation and providence. And all love, uniting and preserving within the created order, is a manifestation of God's own love. Once we see the cosmic nature of love as a unifying and preserving power, we can see that that Dionysius is talking about love even when he doesn't use the term. Eros, for instance, is not used at all in the mystical theology, still less agape, but it is all about ecstatic union, which is what Dionysius means by love. Similarly, the notion of hierarchy, defined in the celestial hierarchy as a sacred order and knowledge and activity which is being assimilated as much as possible to likeness with God, is also to be seen as a manifestation of divine eros, as Dionysius expounds it in his divine names. A final point before we move on. Most scholars writing about Dionysius on love, or indeed almost anything else, raise at some point or other the question, is this Christian or is it Neoplatonist? It's always seemed to me a not very helpful question, though in attempting to answer it, lots of interesting points have emerged. For instance, the notion of Eros Pronoitikos, God's outgoing love for those below him, can easily be found to have a precedent in Proclus or even in Plato. Nevertheless, the notion in Platonists like Proclus has far less scope than Dionysius, for Eros, to the Platonists, is just one of the gods, not particularly exalted, whereas Dionysius' Eros is the love of the creator God himself for the whole cosmos. It's a point made a long time ago by John Rist in Articles. It seems to me, however, that Dionysius would not have understood the contrast being suggested. His pseudonym was adopted, it seems to me, because he saw in Christianity a convergence between the classical tradition of Platonism and the biblical tradition. His teaching, especially on love, is soaked in Platonism or Neoplatonism, but he derives it at critical points from the scriptures, interpreted through his Neoplatonic spectacles, as it were. Early on in his presentation of the doctrine of love in Divine Names 4, seeing the communication of light to beings that turn towards God as ever more abundant, for they loved much. Hoti agapi sen poly, he quotes exactly, save for changing the verb to the plural form, the Lord's commendation of the harlot, who had anointed his feet with myrrh, washed them with her tears, and wiped them with her hair, at the table of Simon the Pharisee. And his example of one who loves ecstatically is none other than Paul the Apostle. The ramifications for this way of looking at Dionysius have recently been explored at some length by Charles Stang in his book Apophasis and Pseudonymity in Dionysius the Areopagite, No Longer I. What about the doctrine of love in Maximus the Confessor? If we open his 4 centuries on love, we seem to be entering an entirely different world. Although his very first words recall Dionysius, Love is a good disposition of the soul, according to which one prefers no creature to the knowledge of God. For there is the same sense that love is a kind of one-centered attention to God. The echo is not very close, and the next two chapters begin to sound very different indeed. The next two chapters run like this. Apatheia gives birth to love, hope in God to apatheia, patience and long-suffering to hope. These are the children of all-embracing self-mastery. Self-mastery, the child of fear of God, and fear comes from faith in the Lord. In the next chapter, he who believes in the Lord fears punishment. The one who fears punishment masters his passions. The one who masters his passions endures hardship. The one who endures hardship will have hope in God. Hope in God separates one from every earthly inclination. The mind separated from these will have love towards God. These two chapters constitute a chiasmus. The first has a sequence: love, apatheia, hope, patience and long-suffering, self-mastery, fear of God, faith in God. The second, the other way around: faith, punishment, mastery of the passions, hardship or tribulation, thripsis, hope, separation from earthly inclinations, love. It's not been generally noticed that what Maximus is doing here is based on a few verses from St. Paul's epistle to the Romans. Neither the critical edition of the centuries, nor either of the English translations that I've consulted in the Philokalia, the English Philokalia, and in Polycarp Sherwood's, make any reference to Romans 5, 1-4, where we read, "Justified then through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have access by faith to this grace in which we stand, and boast on the basis of hope in the glory of God. Not only that, but we take pride in tribulation, knowing that tribulation works patience, patience testing, hope, and hope is not ashamed, for the love of God is poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who is given to us." Paul's sequence: faith, tribulation, patience, testing, dochimi, hope, love. What was for Paul a sequence envisaging the experience of Christians under persecution: faith leading to persecution experiences tribulation, thripsis, borne by patience in a process of testing, the fruit of which is hope, which is rewarded by love poured out in the Holy Spirit, is transposed by Maximus into the progress in ascetic struggle experienced by the monk. It recalls the way in which, with the peace of the church in the 4th century, the role of the martyr was assumed by the ascetic or the monk. The key term thlipsis, for instance, changes its meaning from tribulation under persecution to tribulation under temptation. And indeed, the very notion of temptation shifts. What have we got? Indeed, the very notion of temptation, pierasmos, alters its meaning from persecution, which is maybe beyond our powers, as in the Our Father, to temptation in the sense of challenges to the faithful following of Christ. Both, of course, understood as the result of assaults of demons. And indeed, I think the notion that the Christian is faced by assaults of demons is the thing that holds these two different ways together. The way in which Paul talks of Christians facing persecution, and the way in which Maximus thinks of the monk facing temptation. The ascetic context envisaged by Maximus is underlined by the introduction of a step between hope and love, that is apatheia, calm detachment, enabling one to direct one's whole attention to God. And then earlier on, or later on, depending which way you take it, enkratia, self-mastery, preparing the soul to endure temptation or tribulation. It is these two technical terms from the ascetic vocabulary that are going to be expanded upon in the rest of the centuries. The acquisition of enkratia provides the weapon for fighting against the passions, and the final transcendence of the assault of the passions is manifest in apatheia. And the rest of the centuries revolve largely around the struggle against the passions, and then the final transcendence when one has reached the state of apatheia. There's another striking difference between the Apostle and the Confessor. The Confessor's sequence leads to love, which is the daughter of Apathia, as Evagrius had affirmed. The Apostle's sequence leads to openness to, or receptivity towards love, which is the gift of the Spirit. It's not, I think, that Maximus is unaware of the gratuitousness of love. Rather, I think that at the beginning of his centuries on love, he's concerned to present love as something attainable. The ascetic struggle of the monastic life has love as its goal. There is something we can do about attempting to reach love. It's not just some sort of inspiration. That's the first point I want to make about Maximus' teaching on love, that it is practical. It is concerned with what we can do. At all times, of course, in response to God's grace. The suggested contrast, the contrast that I've suggested between the Apostle and the Confessor is, however, more apparent than real. The Apostle is equally insistent on the practicality of love, while the Confessor, as we shall see, is aware of a dimension to love that is more than just the next step of our ascetic struggle. It is, however, very difficult, at least on the basis of the centuries of love, to be at all systematic about the Confessor's teaching. The very genre of the century, 100 usually fairly brief chapters, often no more than paragraphs or even sentences. This genre had a practical rather than a systematic purpose. The century was meant to be read slowly and meditatively, each chapter intended to provide food for thought and reflection. Only rarely do we find a sequence of chapters developing a point, though quite often we find a sequence of chapters iterating in different ways the same point. This century is also intended to meet the needs of people of very different temperaments. If one finds oneself passing over some chapters rather quickly, whereas other chapters detain one and lead to prolonged self-scrutiny and resolution, then that is deliberate. That is the purpose of a century. It seems to me then easiest to draw attention to threads that run through the centuries rather than to look for any sustained argument. First of all, it's easy to see how the chiasmus presented in the chapters 2 and 3 of the first century, quoted above, underlie the whole of the set of centuries. The movement from faith to love, via the learning of patience, acquisition of self-mastery over the passions, leading to freedom from distraction and a kind of detachment, the two sides of apathia, issuing finally in the capacity to love. This movement forms a kind of ground base to the whole, all four of the centuries. Nonetheless, Maximus is soon reflecting on the final stages of the process. Chapter 10 in the first century tells us, when the intellect, by Eros of Agapi, goes out of itself towards God, then it is conscious neither of itself nor of any of the beings whatsoever. For irradiated by the divine and unbounded light, it is unconscious of any of those things that have been brought into being by him, just as the physical eye has no awareness of the stars when the sun has arisen. There are a few points I want to comment on in this passage. First of all, that expression, the Eros of Agapi. It's clear that Maximus has inherited the sense of a distinction between Eros and Agapi of the kind that we discussed earlier in relation to Dionysios and Gregory. Eros is not opposed to Agapi, rather it is a mode of Agapi, an intensified mode, epitetameni, perhaps. Polycarp Scholl translates the phrase, the burning love of its charity for God. I don't think charity really can any longer be used in English to translate agape, as was the case in older translations. It's too cold a word. As cold as charity is a proverbial expression. It's a pity because it reduces still further the possibilities of translating Greek with its host of words for love. But burning seems to be about right and is supported by some other chapters in Maximus we shall look at later. Only about right, however, for the notion of Eros is always, I think, has the sense of something inspired in us, even a kind of madness that takes us beyond ourselves. Think of the way in which Eros is introduced in the Phaedrus as a further type of divine madness, enthusiasmos, leading on from poetic inspiration. This is made explicit in the second point I want to mention, the notion of going out of oneself in love. For the word used, ekthimi, has the sense of going into exile, in this case from oneself. It is another way of speaking about ecstasy. My third point relates to this. The way in which Maximus thinks of the intellect becoming unconscious of everything brought into being by him, pantata ipaftu yegonota. Even if the intellect becomes unconscious of the created order, it is aware that it is created by God. The reality of the creatures is not diminished or ignored, as it could be if the emphasis on created by God, brought into being by God, had not been made. Now, this is the point I want to pursue now, not for very long. The importance of the natural for Maximus. It is, of course, related to the doctrine of the Logi, but that notion is not particularly present in the centuries, though it's not absent either. Here it is important for understanding Maximus' doctrine of the passions. Normally the term pathos, passion, is a negative term for Maximus. So, for instance, he says that a pure soul is one that is freed from the passions and is gladdened continually by divine love. The following chapter, however, defines pathos and defines it precisely. A blameworthy psekton passion is a movement of the soul against nature, paraphysin. The passions that are blameworthy are unnatural, contrary to nature. But that suggests that there are other passions that are not blameworthy, even natural. And indeed there are. Maximus himself doesn't develop, at least not in the centuries, I'm not sure he does anywhere, the notion of natural and unblameworthy passions, physiki adiavlita pathi, that we find in his close follower, John of Damascus, when he seeks to understand the passible nature of Christ. He's experiencing passions that are not up to us, not ephimin, such as hunger, thirst, tears, rejection of death, and so on. But Maximus does certainly find occasions to use pathos in a positive sense. On one occasion, Maximus discusses the inadequacy of passionless knowledge of things, a knowledge which is aneph-pathous. He says this is no use for turning the mind towards God. And he goes on to argue that just as a simple thought of divine beings does not force the mind to scorn the divine, so a simple knowledge of matters divine doesn't persuade to scorning of matters human. For the truth now exists in shadows and figures. And therefore there is needed the blessed passion of holy love, tu machariou pathous tis agias agapis, to bind the intellect to spiritual contemplation and persuade it to prefer the immaterial to the material and the intellectual and divine to what is perceived by the senses. This is the obverse of the notion that he returns to throughout the centuries, that it is impassioned attachment to what we perceive through the senses that we need to be freed from. Simple awareness is no problem at all, nor, however, is it enough. It could be simply indifference. In the case of the knowledge of God and spiritual things, mere objective knowledge, mere acceptance of their reality is no good. It is necessary if we want to be moved with the blessed passion towards the knowledge of God. In another place, Maximus suggests that in the knowledge of God, all three parts of the soul, the intellect and the two irrational parts, the insensitive and the desiring parts of the soul, are engaged. It is not, as Evagrius sometimes seems to suggest, that in contemplation the irrational parts are laid to sleep so as not to disturb the intellect from its divine contemplation. Rather, for Maximus, the irrational parts have a positive role in such contemplation. So in 248 he says, for one whose intellect is continually with God, his desire is increased beyond measure to divine Eros, and his whole insensitive part is transformed into divine Agapi. For by continual participation in the divine radiance, the intellect becomes wholly full of light, and the passible part of the soul becomes one with it, turns back, as has been said, to divine Eros without end, unceasing Agapi, wholly passing over from earthly things to the divine. And perhaps we may mention one other aspect of Maximus' teaching on love in the centuries. The aim of the ascetic life is this passionate love of God. At the opposite pole to this is self-love, philautia. Self-love is the mother of the passions, or the mother of the vices, which is the love of the body. More precisely, self-love is an impassioned and irrational love of the body, to which are opposed agape and enkratia. To have it is to have all the passions. Another set of analogies is suggested in chapter 56 of the 3rd century, where he says, self-love, as we have said many times, is established as the cause of all impassioned thoughts. For from this are born the 3 generic thoughts of desire: greed, avarice, and vainglory. From greed is born fornication, from avarice, wanting more, from vainglory, pride. All the rest follow on from these: anger, grief, bearing grudges, listlessness, envy, backbiting, and the rest. These passions bind the intellect to material things and drag it down to earth, weighing upon it like a very heavy stone, while by nature it, the intellect, is lighter and sharper than fire. The place of self-love in Maximus' thought was set out very beautifully by Irénée Auxerre in his book Philotie, de la tendresse pour soi à la charité selon Maxime le Confesseur. Not least of the excellences of that book is its inclusion of a translation of Maximus' Ambigua 41 towards the end. For Ambigua 41 is one of the more metaphysical discussions in Maximus. It is the principal source of Maximus' notion of the divisions of nature, to use Eriugenes' designation. However, at the heart of Ambigua 41, Maximus makes it clear that the failure of the human to hold together the divisions of nature is fundamentally a failure to love. The human was meant to move naturally around the unmoved, from whom it owes its being, namely God, but contrary to nature, has chosen to move in ignorance around those things that are beneath it, and thus has frustrated God's plan for the cosmos by relinquishing its role as the natural bond, the syndesmos, of the cosmos. And God's remedy is one of love. In a paradoxical way, that which is completely unmoved by nature is moved immovably around that which is by nature moved, and God becomes a human being in order to save lost humanity. Christ, God made man, is then able to fulfill the human side of the cosmos, and more than that, restore the human to his natural role in the cosmos. The ascetic program that is laid out in the centuries, for example, is here seen to be fundamental to the coherence of the cosmos as a whole. This makes clear what we can glean from other parts of Maximus' works, that the ascetical has for him a cosmic role. And in this we can see the way in which, behind Maximus' fundamentally ascetic approach to the concept of love, there can be discerned the cosmic approach of that mysterious thinker to whom he owed so much, Dionysios the Areopagite. I got another bit, but I think actually it's probably enough. Don't you think? Otherwise, I'll fill up all the space and there'll be no time for discussion. Let me just read my conclusion. Maximus and Dionysius are one in seeing love as something rooted in nature. It is something that brings out what our human nature fundamentally is. Indeed, there is a clear suggestion in Dionysius and in Maximus, if you look deeply enough, that it is love that underlies the structure of being. This means, whatever differences then we may detect between Dionysius and Maximus, that what they share is more fundamental. How do they differ and why? Partly because of their different concerns. Both are probably monks, though this is only a plausible suggestion in the case of Dionysius. But Maximus is always conscious that he's addressing the ascetic struggle to which the monk is committed by his vocation. Even when he's writing for a layman, as in the second letter, he is concerned both to extol love and to underline what it entails in practical terms. Dionysius, on the other hand, is more concerned to celebrate love as a principle of the coming into being and indeed the purpose of the cosmos. And there may be another difference behind Maximus and Dionysius, though I am not so sure about this. Maximus seems, how can I put it? Maximus seems often to echo the Aristotelian tradition in a much more evident way than we find it in Dionysius. And this could be the result of some kind of trickle-down effect from the vast work of commentary on Aristotle that reached its climax in the early decades, really, of Maximus's own life. So the difference that is clearly present between Dionysius and Maximus may have something to do with the different ways in which they relate to Plato and Aristotle. So, raising a few questions that may find an answer in this gathering, I bring this paper to a close.
Thank you so much. Yes, we have now time for questions or comments.
So, thank you very much. It was very interesting, increased for the comparison, and because you refer to Aristotle. So, when you're talking about Dionysios, you said that perhaps the one God can be confessed to be unmoved mover. Now, according to some interpretations of Aristotle per se, one would say that the unmoved mover, because it is unmoved, it is only a final cause. Not also an efficient cause. Now, of course, in Neoplatonism, the one is both, so efficient and final. And then this is taken also by Dionysius. One interesting thing is that Ammonius, the son of Hermias, another Neoplatonist, was fan also of Aristotle, had said that what actually Aristotle meant was that the one is not only final cause, but also efficient. So I think this would fill somehow the picture if we wanted to say that Dionysius there can be compared to Aristotle through a Neoplatonic spectacle.
I think absolutely right, yeah. I mean, in the discussion, the bit where I mentioned it, he does talk about God. Well, he talked about God's being unmoved, and yet paradoxically moving himself into the created order. And in this way, therefore, as you say, he goes well beyond what Aristotle is normally held to have meant when he says that the unmoved mover moves by being loved. He is the final cause of the created order, and that's how motion occurs. It's well beyond that, and you could say yes, it's the language of the vision cause, and it's also clear that any kind of, you would expect anybody in the 6th or 7th century reading Aristotle to read him with Platonic spectacles, because of what he did. And all, the Aristotelian commentaries are largely commentaries by people who fit into a Neoplatonic tradition. But there's this enormous interest in Aristotle. It reaches it's got a climax in the 6th century. And if you compare Maximus with the Cappadocian Fathers, for instance, one of the things I think that is striking is the extent to which Maximus seems more readily to draw on the Aristotelian tradition than you would find in, say, Gregory of Nyssa, for instance. It was much more sort of clear, much more clearly much more clearly a Middle Platonist in the way he thinks about things. And it's a kind of vast work for, I think, even beyond sort of a PhD, to explore the Aristotelian commentaries of the 6th century and see how much Maximus might owe to them. If he does owe a great deal, it would answer lots of questions about sort of how Maximus's thought is formed. You can point to the people that he uses. I don't sorry, I don't think that there's much evidence that he has any recourse to other than Christian sources. Almost everything Neoplatonic in him is found in Dionysios. But there's this difference of tone, which is quite striking, and where it comes from, I'm not sure.
Before Paulus next, you speak so much about centuries. I put it on the board here because I suppose this is a special genre, a way of writing in a period in the tradition. So if I just quickly simply explain it, in 1 century consists of 100 chapters.
It's 100 chapters.
Yes.
It was invented by Evagrius. Evagrius died in 399.
Yes.
And he's sometimes described as the metaphysician of the desert, as it were, the philosopher of the desert. He was one of the desert fathers, highly learned. He uses the notion of a century as a way of writing for monks. They're short chapters, and obviously the way you're meant to read them is not to read stuff at the beginning, work your way through to get to the end, but read and contemplate, read and think and meditate on them. And it becomes a very popular tradition. In the 5th century, Diodicus writes the century. They're quite chunky chapters, but nonetheless, he has a century. And then Maximus, there are at least 6 centuries of Maximus, and the tradition continues. I mean, if you look at the Philippilia, so many of the works in the Philippilia take the form of the century.
And my own author writes one century.
That's right. He's the 5th century figure. Yes.
Right.
Thanks.
Okay, then Paul.
I think that one main theme which will we deal with in all these 5 days is whether to grasp the concept of love in theology and in ontology and in ethics. Just one simple question from the perspective of an ethicist. How would you describe the ethical dimensions of the concept of love in Dionysios? Could you use the word virtue? Is love a virtue in Dionysios? Is it an attitude? Or is it an act?
I think that virtually all Christian thought, until, Kant practically, virtue ethics is the normal way of doing it. Even though you might think it wouldn't be, because the Old Testament is full of commands and instructions and so on. In fact, when I think from Origin onwards, perhaps even earlier, the natural way of talking about ethics is to talk about virtues. And love is seen as the highest of the virtues, or is something that is prepared for by the virtues. It seems to me that, put it like this, there seems to be well, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that when one talks about ethics, there are different ways in which one might think what one is doing. And one way, which has become very common, it seems to me, in the last few centuries, is to say what ethics is about is how do we decide what to do? What is the good thing to do? How do we decide between, how do we make a choice between the good and the less good and the bad? But there's another way of answering the question, and this is to say, not how do I make choices, but how do I become someone who is good? And if I'm somebody who is good, then what I do will be good, because I'm good. And that, it seems to me, is the question that virtue ethics is. Virtue ethics is not concerned with how to make a decision. It's concerned with how to be the kind of person who will make the right decision, because you're not afraid of consequences, because you're somebody who is in control. And enkratia is, in fact, the word that is the central term, it seems to me, in Maximus' understanding of virtue. enkratia, self-mastery, means that what we do what we want to do because we are in control of ourselves. We're not, how can I put it, there's a very interesting, I think rather colourful way of putting this in another of these early Christian sources, the Macarian Homilies. And he says that what happens to us often is that we find we do things that are atopos, out of place. And that happens because we don't know who we are. And so we're faced with a situation, and we suddenly discover a bit of ourselves really wants to do something. And where does this come from? But we can't, because we're not aware of it, it takes control of us, and we find ourselves doing things that are entirely out of character. And the whole purpose of the ethical life, as you know, the life of virtue, for within that tradition, is, as it were, to increase our self-knowledge to such a point that there is not anything in us that we are not aware of and we're not in control of. And that seems to me to be a way of characterizing virtue ethics.
Yes, Vladimir.
Thank you for the rich, inspiring paper. Well, I'm very glad that at the end you mentioned this passage from Book 81. I think it's very crucial for understanding law. And I would like to ask you, once later you have this kind of deep reading of it, is this Maximos described the fifth division, is that human person unites created with uncreated nature by law.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the human person, like hypothetically, I'm not talking about Christ, I'm talking
Yes,
about,
yeah.
has this capacity to bridge this gulf between created and uncreated?
I think Maximos is quite clear about this. On the one hand, it is in virtue of our being created in the image of God, we have this capacity, in theory. In practice, we've ruined it by the fall, and it's only because of the incarnation it can be restored. So fallen man cannot unite the created with the uncreated through love.
That is incarnation in case that human being didn't fall, incarnation wouldn't be necessary.
You see, Maximos doesn't speculate on this sort of thing. That's the trouble. I mean, he may think that, he may not think that, but he doesn't discuss it, he doesn't address it. I mean, the fact is we are fallen, and that's where we start from. God created us unfallen, certainly, and what we are as unfallen is what we're meant to be. But we're not like that. And if you are, the question which, which is exercised later theologians, is the incarnation necessary? I don't think you can get a straight answer from this from Maximus, because Maximus doesn't think about it. He doesn't consider it. But certainly as things are, the incarnation is necessary. And without the incarnation, the divisions of nature are separated. They don't unite. They divide. They're meant to be, the divisions between the created and uncreated, within the created, between the intellectual and the material, in the material world, between the inhabited world and paradise and so on. All of these divisions are meant to be divisions that, if you like, spell out the rich manifoldness of the created order. The created order is inevitably manifold, because it has to be many things, because it's not God. And it's meant to express the richness of God's love. It is infinite in its wonder. Right. But what has happened is, as a result of the fall and not being able to hold these tensions together, these tensions now pull everything apart. I mean, paradise and earth are not, paradise and the inhabited world are separate. I mean, I think he probably thought physically separate, and you couldn't get from one to the other. And this, I think, all the divisions, as it were, are now devised, are now clefts that divide. And in the incarnation, as it says in Anglican 41, all of these divisions are overcome, making it possible for the human in Christ to fulfill the role that he was meant to fulfill in the original creation. And it's the Anglican 41 is absolutely crucial. It's a relatively short treatise, about 5 or 6 pages, and it's crucial because what's it about? It's about metaphysics and it's about love, and the two things are sort of held together in a very tight way.
That's
Yeah.
It's 41.
It's 41.
41.
I will just follow up a bit on what Vladimir asked about reading Ontologium 60.
Mm-hmm.
One could get the impression that, so to say, the purpose of making the world culminates in the hypostatic union.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, would incarnation have come without the fall?
That's the best place to work from. But even so, I think I'm not sure that you can read it. I'm not sure that you can read Atlassium 60 as answering this question whether the incarnation is necessary or not. If we look at things as they are now, then this is the case. Everything culminates in the hypostatic union.
And I won't talk about necessity. I mean, necessity is very, I don't like that.
No.
You have to be a bit more sophisticated, I suppose. The first one. Divine plan. To be a bit vague. Divine plan.
Well, I think you can get further. I mean, I think there is no question in Maximus that put it like this: what happens as a result of the fall? The way God's plan for the created order. He doesn't fall back on a plan B, as it were. He had plan A, created man, it went wrong, and then fell back on plan. The economy of God seems to me to be single and united. There's not, as it were, if this happens, that happens. And if he doesn't think in these terms, and I think actually quite clearly thinks that it would not make sense to say that the created order defeated the creator. And I suppose, yes, I think once you start to think like that, then the question of the incarnation becomes, as it were, part of the way things are. And if that's part of the way things are, then there's another way of saying, if you like, it's necessary.
I have a question also. In Maximus, would you say that he uses the distinction that we find very, very clearly in the Septuagint translation between image and likeness in the way of in the process of deification and so on, between Akon and homoiousis?
I think he does. I think that he.
It's so common in many of the other fathers.
Well, you get in. There are some fathers for whom image and likeness just mean more or less the same thing. Athanasius, for instance. Gregory of Nyssa, I think, as well. And others where it's clear, there's a clear distinction. Origins is one. I mean, Origins seems...
Clement is
Sorry?
first. Clement also had
Yes, I know. Clement... Arians people argue about that, as well as the distinction. But Clement certainly has a distinction. And certainly also in... Origen doesn't simply make a distinction. He argues the distinction is there in the biblical text. Because it says, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. And the next verse goes on to say, and God created man in his image. And doesn't say his likeness. And so likeness for Origin is derived from the biblical text. I mean, image is how we're created, and likeness is where we're going. And Maximus has that. I mean, I think Maximus very clearly has that.
It's very clear in Dionysios also.
Mm.
Maximus is very Dionysios.
Yeah. I think Maximus quotes them in Dionysios, so
Yeah.
I think it's very likely. It's possible, actually, interesting. I think that
You know, this station in first, Genesis 1:26, God created man. It's not in our Norwegian translation clear, but it says God created man. You have me. After his likeness, I think it's
yes,
called.
it's both katikona,
Yeah.
kathias.
Yeah, so it's very clear, similar with kat ikona and kat homoiosis.
That's right.
And so they made a whole teaching out of this
Yes.
distinction, which is very unfamiliar in the Western.
And one of the reasons, I think, why it occurs is that if you read the Genesis with Plato in the back of your mind, Plato says that flight from the world is likeness, homeosis to theo, katadadinaton. As far as possible. See, if you read the Septuagint text with Plato in the back of your mind, you see them as different because the image is one thing, the likeness is what Plato is talking about. It's a process, and actually the very word used is interesting because it seems that ending, the osis ending, usually means a process in Greek. If it was a likeness, it would use homeotes or something like that. But it isn't just likeness. The word used is a word for a process. Now, there's nothing of this in Hebrew, but it's but once you've got it in Greek, and once you're reading, a Greek reading the New Testament in Greek, is going to pick up overtones, and that's a very striking one. Homeosis is a process, so it's clearly distinct from.
Yes, more questions?
Thank you. So something about Maximus again, so this is about the subject of love. So in Plato, for example, in the Republic, we would say that the appetitive part of our soul can have some desires which are related to the body, for example, a sexual desire. But also we can have love for philosophy. So it's the love of wisdom. So perhaps then we have love of the center of which is the mind, and another one which is the lowest part of the soul. So do we find something like this in Maximus? Because you said that we have the negative passions, but also the good ones. For example, Eros, and I was wondering whether this has to do only with the mind or with the whole human person.
I think Maximus is quite clear that it is concerned with the whole human person. And there are several, I quoted a few places where he, for instance, if you take somebody like Evagrius and ask what Eros means in relation to God, this would be a movement of the intellect towards God. And this Eros will be fulfilled if the irrational parts of the soul keep quiet and don't disturb it. And the impression that you get from Evagrius is the purpose of the purpose of apatheia is to keep the irrational part of the soul quiet, so that the mind can turn towards God in pure eros. Right? Now that's not the way Maximus puts it. Maximus says what the irrational parts of the soul support the intellect in its movement towards God, and so they're not just quiet, but the epithemia is full of eros, and the themos is full of agape. He specifically says this. I've quoted it to me. So there you got the sense that eros and agape can also be used of the intellect, but they can also be very directly used of the lower parts of the soul. So the angry bit of the soul expresses itself in agape, outgoing love towards other people, and the epithemia, which can be sort of taken up with hunger, thirst, sex, and so on, actually is consumed with divine eros, as he puts it. So he has very strong, I think very, very strong and explicit sense that in the spiritual life, as we turn towards God, it is the whole person that turns towards God, not the irrational parts of being sort of being sort of banked down so that they don't disturb.
Okay, then I think we